Okay, so I'm really excited again, finally after a long break, to have another TEFL equity webinar. And it's great to have Laura speaking from Seattle and Adriana, you were in Austin, right?
Arizona.
Arizona, sorry. And the topic today is language ownership, empowering teachers and learners. So a very interesting topic indeed. I'm really curious what you're going to talk about. And this webinar is being recorded, so you can also view it later on YouTube. We'll upload it up there. And yeah, I'll leave the floor to Laura and Adriana for another sort of 55 minutes, and then we'll finish the webinar in about an hour. And I also wanted to thank the Belgian English Language Teaching Association. Um, Without them, this series of webinar wouldn't be possible. So I'm really grateful that they're lending us the webinar room. And yeah, the floor is yours, Laura and Adriana. Thanks for being here, and looking forward to the webinar.
Thank you. Okay, so well, first, thanks, Marek, for inviting us and having us here today, and thank you, Belgium, too, for hosting this space. Really appreciate it. Um, and so again, we're going to talk about language ownership and especially focus on ways in which we can empower teachers and learners when thinking about this topic. Um, let's see if I go to the next slide. Okay. Huh. Sorry, just a minute. Yeah, but the one about ourselves is not there with the pictures. That was before that one.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's introduce ourselves here. So again, my name's Laura, and I currently teach first-year college students. I teach an English composition class, and so I mainly teach writing. I've also taught English for academic purposes, mainly at colleges, and I've taught EFL in Colombia, in China, Turkey, and Italy briefly. I studied TESOL. I got my MA in TESOL at the New School where I met Adriana, and then now I've actually recently started my doctorate in TESOL. I'm doing an EDD at Anaheim University. So that's a little bit about me in terms of professionally, and then as a language user, I have three first languages. That would be Italian, Spanish, and English. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And French is another language that I've learned. It's a language that I learned later on in life. So now to Adriana.
I have just one first language, Portuguese. I was born and raised in Brazil, where I started my teaching career as an EFL teacher. And then I moved to the United States in 2004, and I taught ESL in Utah. And then we moved to New Jersey, where I taught ESL to adult immigrants. As a language learner, I started learning English when I was 16 in Brazil. And we're going to be talking more about our identities as language speakers as well throughout the webinar. But to start the conversation on labels, so I identify as a non-native speaker. That's one label that is very common out there, native speaker, non-native speaker. So we have our first poll on, I don't know if Marek can bring that up.
Okay, so we want to know who. There we go.
Yeah. Who are you? Yeah.
So if you can. Go ahead, Ari.
No, I was just wondering, like, yeah, you should be able to. I don't know if you can. I don't think you can choose more than one. Well, I guess we just choose one. I think we have.
Okay, that looks like that's everyone. So now we could.
Clicking is enough to vote, yes. I think we're invite should we end poll? Sorry, it's first time we do this. So. And broadcast
I clicked
results?
on.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So can everyone see the results there?
Yeah, they can see it. Okay, so we have a lot of non-native speakers and multilingual, bilingual. Yeah. Oh, and I forgot to mention. So, if you do you have any questions about what any of these mean? Is everyone good with all the labels regarding meaning? Okay.
So it's interesting to note there's an equal amount here of people who identify as native speakers and also multilingual.
Okay. Multi-competent is a label that maybe some people may not familiar with. So I do understand, to give a personal example, I do understand spoken and written Spanish, but I don't consider myself a Spanish speaker. So that's why I would say I'm multi-competent in different languages. I'm an English speaker, a Portuguese speaker, but not a Spanish speaker. Yeah, we're going to be talking about who we are as a non-native ESL teacher. Multilingual to me, it means just that you speak more than one language.
Interesting. Okay, so
it doesn't have to
we
be first language. I consider myself multilingual, although I have just one first language. At what level? That's something we're going to be talking about as well. So I think we're going to be addressing most of the questions, I think, throughout the webinar. So should we go to the second poll about your students? So thinking about your students this time, what labels, and I understand that ideally you'll be able to choose more than one, right? Yeah, I know we can only pick one. Sorry, first time we do polls. Choose the one that best describes your students. Okay, so that's probably good. This is a tough question. So yeah, no native speakers, multilingual, and one person said monolingual. So this just to start the conversation about labels, and then Laura is going to talk a little bit more about our position regarding some of these.
Thank you. Yeah, so actually some background on that. The reason we came up with all this when we're talking about labels, and when we first started planning this webinar, we were thinking like, okay, so what are, actually let me move forward there for a second.
Yeah.
There we go, I'll leave it here. Okay, so we're thinking about these labels. We said, okay, so what do they mean, and how do you identify yourself, Adriana? Like and thinking about all the different languages maybe that we've learned or that we may use. And at the TEFL convention, Adriana and I worked together, and we started having conversations with people that we met, teachers that we met, who were self-identified as being very competent in a second language. In this case, actually, by coincidence, all of them were competent in Spanish. And we asked them, okay, so are you bilingual? And they're like, no, 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 I'm not bilingual. Like, I mean, very, very strongly said, no, I'm not bilingual. And again, remember, we're in the US, so in this kind of context of being, like, that was the context of the questions. And then we asked them, oh, okay, so, and so your students here in the US, are they bilingual? And we always got, the answer that we got was, yes, they are. We're like, interesting. So what's the difference between your students and you in being bilingual? And we couldn't really get an answer for that. But what it made us think was that there's a lot more behind these labels that goes beyond language use, right? So some of you were asking, do I have to be a native speaker, or is it, if I'm a native speaker, to be multilingual, or what level? I don't think there are straight answers for that, quite frankly. A lot of the time, these labels have more to do, relate to more than just language use. So that's part of what we're going to be talking about. And our position on this topic is that this dichotomy between native speaker and non-native speaker is actually affecting us professionally. It affects the way that we see ourselves and others see us. It has some ramifications to how we teach and how we interact to others in the field. And most importantly, those established ideals that we have of what a native speaker is or what it isn't are used in our materials, and it has in our common discourse, and it does have a negative effect on our learners. So we want to start with that, but definitely have a conversation throughout our presentation. And Adriana is going to give you a brief outline of that too, so you know kind of what our patterns are here in terms of as we keep speaking. So, Ari?
Okay. Okay. So, so after many hours of conversation, Laura and I settled into like two main constructs we're going to address in this webinar: identity and language ownership, and they are closely related. And then we're going to talk about critical pedagogy, the way to address these in the classroom. So for each one of these, we'll be talking about what it is, that's the title, and why it matters. So we're going to talk about definitions, what it looks like for teachers and English learners. And we're going to go over some learning tasks and talk about like the teacher role in the classroom when talking about these. In between each one of these sections, we're going to have a few minutes for questions, and then we can stop for a few minutes and address your questions. And there's also a handout I shared on Facebook, and I'm going to copy and paste the link here, where we're going to, you don't have to look at the handout now. I don't want to distract you. But later in the presentation, we're going to be, I'm going to be referring to some of the resources in the handout. This is more like for after the webinar. And then, okay, so Laura is going to talk, start the identity section.
Excellent. Oh, so we lost our little picture here. All right. So there was a little image there, but no worries. We're going to talk then about identity and sort of define it and explain why it matters. First of all, identity has to do with the way we see ourselves, but not only, it's also the way others perceive us, right? And quite often that's based on our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, our socioeconomic status, our gender, our beliefs. I mean, the list goes on. But I think it's important to remember that identity is not fixed. It's a dynamic concept, and it's multiple. Sometimes it's in conflict. This is a quote I got from a study in which the language teacher identity of 3 different teachers was examined. And again, there are many parts of who we are that are not always, that change. So when we look at native speaker and non-native speaker labels, I think part of the problem is that those are our fixed labels, right? Most of the time we don't see somebody kind of going from one to another. And labels, just to stop for a second about the importance of labels, they do have an effect on our day-to-day life. Some people might claim like, oh, but if I'm not using them right now, I have to be politically correct. And I think it's not about being politically correct or not. It's about making a decision when we use these labels. I think as language teachers, we understand the power of language, and we understand what the effects of certain language are. And so, when we use these position us in terms of who we are and what we're capable of. So it's important to be aware of that. One of the, again, as I was saying, they're inadequate because they're fixed, and also they don't, as much as we think they do, talk about our abilities in language use. They really don't just refer to that. You know, because here I have some few questions that might make us think about it. If you are someone who learned English as a 10-year-old, but then you stop speaking it, so you go all your life without speaking it. By the time you're 60, you don't even remember it. Are you still a native speaker of English? Or what about somebody who learned English in a place like Nigeria when they were a child? It was their first language. Would the world consider them a native English speaker? These are some of the questions that people ask sometimes when they start questioning native speaker or non-native speaker labels. The fact is that they do create a sense of otherness. A native speaker is seen somehow as a guest in this. A non-native speaker is seen as a guest of this language that we're discussing. Or it's maybe somebody who doesn't quite meet the standard. In fact, we even have a word for near native proficiency. So like if you're non-native, you're not quite there yet, you're the other. There's a deficiency approach, so it's kind of what I'm saying right now. But I think the part that is, to me, that's really important to keep in mind is that we're really talking about somebody's identity and basing it from what they're not. And I don't know what other aspects, I don't think there are other aspects of identity in which we do that. I mean, we don't normally say somebody's non-white or non-female or non-poor or non-engineer. Why is it okay to do that with language? Why is it all right to just say non-native then? And I'd like to just share a personal story. My connection to that is that I was born in the U.S. From Italian dad, Colombian mom, and my mom's actually here in the webinar, which is really nice to see her. I grew up speaking English until I was 6 or 7 years old. Italian and English were my dominant languages, and I knew some Spanish as well. But I left the U.S. and I never thought I'd come back. I didn't have like formal, bilingual studies. And when I was 17 and came back to the U.S., I had to take ESL classes, and I was definitely seen as a non-native speaker. But technically, I was a native speaker, right? I mean, how does that work then in that case? I never felt comfortable with the labels. I still don't. I've benefited from native speaker privilege just because my skin color is lighter and I have an American passport. So when I was teaching in China, I got to do something that I wouldn't have if my mom had just given birth to me in Colombia. I was seen as a native speaker because I had that passport. When I went to Colombia in my mid-20s and started teaching there, I also benefited from this perception others had that I was a native speaker, even though until a few years before that, I myself couldn't really see that, and I still really don't. And a lot of people around me here don't really see me as a native speaker. They might just see me as a non-native speaker, which to me just says, like, again, those labels are inadequate. They're inaccurate in my case. And I know that that's just my situation, which is pretty unique to an extent, but there's many other people for which these labels also don't work. So moving on into the learners. We've learned from Dornay, who's one of the top scholars discussing motivation, about something called the L2 motivational self system. It's a concept that he's put forward in which he basically claims that language learners find motivation in being able to have a vision of their identity as language users in certain different phases of their learning. So I can envision myself, for example, Turkish is a language that I started learning when I lived in Turkey. I can see myself as a Turkish speaker at the supermarket versus a Turkish scholar if I wanted to get to that point. But actually seeing that and envisioning myself will be kind of how I make my language use. Well, when we teach, we use a lot of, we have these native speaker ideals, right, that come from our textbooks mainly. If we're using a textbook, I realize not everyone does. But when you look at the textbooks in our industry, all of them are using this standard English, depending on which country you are. If you're in the US or Canada or Britain, it's this standard English that normally won't be like Indian standard English or Nigerian English. It's a kind of English that mainly represents white Eurocentric views, and it's not relatable to most of our context. So if I think of my own context here in Seattle, that English that's presented on the books, it's not going to show my students the Latino population, the Asian population, African American populations. And you know, those are the models that we're giving to students, like when we tell them, go to the tutoring center and you're going to practice with native speakers. You know, if that's the model that we have, we believe that we're kind of setting them for failure. We're not giving them a model of somebody that they can actually relate to and see themselves there. And I think for us as teachers, we need to think about those standards that are chosen in our materials and in general when we say, like, this is what you should look up to. If they don't really represent our learners and you know, but they do represent, like, why are we choosing that? What does that say about who we want to be in terms of models? So let's look at, for teachers, what that does. So when we're seen as non-native speakers, and that's the first thing that comes in terms of our identity forward as a teacher, you're a non-native teacher of English, you might suffer from some of these things. So foreigner talk, that's when even though people know you speak the language, they speak slowly to you and use all the gestures, and that's condescending. There's recasting, so kind of correcting things in case of pronunciation or repeating what you've said. I know that's happened to me before in a professional environment where it's completely not acceptable. You know, for native speakers, it's also having this dichotomy doesn't only affect non-native teachers. It also affects, or so-called non-native teachers, but it affects native speakers as well. It's a big generalization, but it happens quite often that native speaker teachers are limited to teaching fun speaking classes when they go abroad. They're seen as not having the grammar skills or the ability to teach the other things that are actually going to be left for the local teachers. There's a case study that I read by Gloria Park in which she takes female Asian or female, mostly Chinese, I believe maybe some Korean too, teachers who come to the U.S. to do their master's in teaching. And she, you know, starts through journals, starts seeing how their identity changes and how it affects their teaching. And the biggest thing that's reported is insecurity. If you're seen as a non-native teacher first and foremost, and you're in an English-speaking country, there's a lot of insecurity about your own skills. But I think that also really it's important to keep in mind that this whole like non-native or native speaker label, it's again not only about language. Really, a lot of the time it has to do with race and nationality. So if, for an African American teacher, for example, who was born in the place like say Canada or the U.S. to go teach in other countries, they might not be allowed. They might, even though they're technically a native speaker, they may not be seen as one. And it's important to acknowledge the political aspect of what those labels carry. Now we want to talk about how we deal with this with our students. And again, here I had a little picture of LO, which is a website I really like to use, and I'd encourage you to check out if you don't know it already. When we use it I've used it for listening and to kind of build awareness with our students that there's a lot, in reality, there's a lot of different varieties of English and people having different accents and ways of using it. And on that website, you can see quizzes, a lot of conversations between up to like 6 speakers. There's the text is right there. And I think it's great to like just expose students to people at different levels using English in different ways that don't really match what you see on artificial textbooks. Adriana is now going to tell us a little bit about ways to discuss this in class.
Yeah, so the link for LO is also on the handout, and I also shared 2 links to different videos on the handout to start the discussion and to start raising awareness of these issues of identity and perceived identity. So one of the videos Laura shared with you on the Facebook event page. You may have seen it. It's an Asian American woman running, and then this other guy asks her where she's from, and then she said, "Oh, from I don't know, San Diego." And he said, "But where are you from?" And he started talking, like doing the foreigner talk, because he assumed she's not American because she doesn't look like she's not like the standard white American. And the other video may be more relevant here in the United States because we have a lot of Spanish speakers and people who identify as Latino. And they talk about if you have to speak Spanish to be considered Latino, to identify yourself as Latino. And also, this is a good way of bringing students first languages to the discussion, right? The experiences they have in other languages other than English. Both videos are in English, though. So yeah, so these like start talking about it, and I usually don't point out to students like what I want them to see, and it's pretty obvious. I ask questions like, why was the guy talking about like that to the woman? So students can start to realize that people make assumptions about our identities even before they hear us, even before they hear my accent. They're already making assumptions about my identity as a speaker. So I think, yeah, so identity is a topic that we can go on and on for days. And Laura and I kind of have done that. So there's supposed to be a question mark here. So this is a moment where we can address a few questions. And Natalia wrote something, accommodation strategies can be patronizing. And sometimes it's not on purpose, right? Foreign talk happens without the native speaker realizing they're doing it. Native speakers will complete to keep the equivalent to strategies. Yeah, so we're going to talk about how to first raise awareness of these issues in the classroom, so the students can notice these outside the classroom, and develop strategies, right? How can the students deal with that? How can the students deal when people do the foreign talk, or they claim they don't understand them when they do actually? Okay, so maybe we should move on to, we do have more questions for you about language ownership. So before I start talking about language ownership, if you can use the chat box to answer these two questions. So in your, what do you understand by language ownership? And what does it mean to you to have the right to use a language? If people are typing, I can see you typing. Feeling like the language is yours? Yeah. Language ownership is like freedom to use the language without prejudice. Being able to do what you need to do in your life with the language, yours to play with, to change, to decide what's a mistake and what's creative, to be proud of your accent. Good point. Having the ability to do what I want with language and not to be told that I'm wrong. Good point. Also. Language ownership does not exist. Wow.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, me too. I don't know if I have time though. That sounds like a question that we could talk about for a long, long time. Okay, so I agree with most people here. To me, language ownership is to feel it's mine. So and it's that my, so I feel like I have ownership over English with my accent, to be proud of my accent, to play with, to pronounce the things the way I pronounce them, and the way I use it may be different from the way native speakers use it. So that's what it means to have the right to use the language, to feel that you can use it even making what other people would consider mistakes, right? To like or even love the language. Owns the language, nobody can. So, but personally, I do feel that you do have the sense of like of going through that process of feeling that you have the right to use the language. So to give you a personal story, I was IFL teacher in Brazil, and then when I moved here, I felt I had ownership over the language I used in the classroom, but outside the classroom, social events. because my identity was still developing. As an adult, I was 23 here and I had just married. So as a wife, so my social identity outside the classroom was still developing. So it took me a while longer to feel that I had the ownership to speak over English, to speak English outside in social situations. And like Laura mentioned, native speakers are constantly challenged sometimes because of this, like, oh, you didn't pronounce that word the way I pronounced it. So that recently happened to me in my PhD program. I was having a discussion with one of my classmates, and I was disagreeing with him. And in the middle of my argument, I was talking, and he said, like, what did you say? I didn't understand that word. And he gave me like a mini pronunciation lesson on how to pronounce something. And it was totally like he was trying to remove my right to speak the language, maybe because he was not agreeing with me. And he didn't have, I don't know. I don't think he did it consciously. I don't think he did it to be mean to me. But that's like the point I want to make. I'm going to skip that slide about how language ownership is a two-way street. It's not only how you define that you own the language you have the right to use, that you have the confidence, but also how other people perceive you to have the right or not, right? And they can try to remove the right from you. And like I said, language ownership is directly related to identity. And again, identity is also not something that is only defined by you, but is also defined by others. Even like here as a speaker, even though you haven't spoken yet, people will assign you a certain identity. So then we ask, what if the ideal identity that students set up for them is like, I want to speak as a native speaker. Does that mean that they don't feel they have the right to speak until they achieve that near native proficiency level? And if I believe that practice and actually speaking, not inside the classroom, but also outside the classroom, improves your proficiency, is the best way to improve your proficiency, then does that mean that students will never speak and they will never achieve that proficiency? So that's why it's important to realize and to tell students that these identities and language ownership, they are not fixed, right? It can change over time. And then back in 1997, Norton pointed out that there are more people who speak English as an international language, as a second language or foreign language, than actually native speakers. So who owns English internationally? What's the variety we have to teach or we should teach our students? And that question is still relevant today. So another question for you to use the text box. Oh, we have a poll for this, right? Yeah, we have a poll. Do you feel you have the right to use English in every type of situation? Why or why not?
Not sure if Mark. Oh, there you go. Excellent.
And for the reasons, you can use the chat box to justify your. Okay. Okay, that's it. I guess from everyone. No. Right. Oops, people changed. Okay, sorry. So yeah, I guess that's good. And then our next goal is like about your students. Have you created that? If you feel your students feel they have the right to use English outside the classroom.
And so I think, Mark, we have one more.
We may not have done that. I don't know, actually. So if you can type your answer, do you think, I have this here. Do you think your students feel that they have the right to use English in what situation or why not? And you may not know. So if you can use the chat box to answer. Okay. Yeah, maybe we didn't make it. That's fine. We can probably use the chat box.
Yeah, that's okay. Here we think we're trying to compare like students and teachers.
I'm not sure. Emilia said that she's not sure about the right, but they use it as a lingua franca to level the playing field when speaking with other non-native speakers. They do have the right, actually, even if they are not competent. Yes, I agree. But maybe they don't feel like they do. And maybe like other people, like other native speakers, may not perceive them as having the right. That would happen a lot in New Jersey. Who's supposed to give them the right? That's a good question, and that's a difficult question to answer. So like I said, it's a two-way street. Like it's like you feel you have the right, but also some people can challenge you on that, right? The moment like they correct you or they actually, I've witnessed some customers like in a laundromat being rude to a person who had she was a Spanish speaker, she had a heavy accent, and the person was mad because she couldn't do whatever he was asking her to do, and he said like, you have to learn English, your English is not good enough, right? So that's a way of challenging the right of the person being there as well, right?
I think we should probably move on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the guy correcting you. Okay, so Laura is going to expand more on that, on the language ownership, what it looks like for teachers.
Yeah, so when we're talking about ownership, we're really talking about feeling like, or like, this is either you see it or other people see it in you, but that's your right to use a language. That's also like it's your language. You're supposed to like there's certain expectations about what you do with it, or it's not your language if you're a non-native speaker. And for native speakers, they're perceived as being language experts regarding all varieties of the language that they're native speakers of. And I think you can take off English and insert another language if that's your first language, your dominant language. But it's not probably accurate to say this. I mean, let's say I'm an English native speaker of English. Do I know all the varieties of English, say even within the U.S. and all the differences and why people do certain things? Probably not. There's also an assumed ability that you can teach a language. And as probably most of us know, that doesn't happen just because you know a language. You need some education training to be able to teach a language, or you're expected to use that language at all times, right? That's supposedly how what you're better suited to do when you're socializing, when you're talking with other people. That's a language you're going to be using always. As a non-native speaker, there's a perceived lack of authority to discuss certain things. You supposedly do not have that like internal check that tells you when something's right or wrong. You're like, oh, but that's not how we say it. And we know that internal like measurement of what's right and what's wrong sometimes is actually not accurate. That's why we have corpus-based tools to be able to see what people generally say or don't say. Again, there's a questionability to teach English in English-speaking countries, and there's somehow like, well, why are you doing that here? You should go to your native country and then teach it there. Or teachers might find that when always been perceived from this like lack of this deficiency view of being a non-native speaker, that maybe you're comfortable using it in the classroom, but not necessarily outside of the classroom. So that's part of how ownership looks like for two kinds of speakers if we have this kind of dichotomy. But we believe that when you're an active member, when you have agency, this is like the term that gets used a lot, but when you're an active participant in the language that you're using, in this case we're talking English, it really goes beyond just being self-confident or having a desire to join communities of practice. This is what a motivation gets called like integrative motivation, your desire to like join and be part of that culture. But what we're saying is that it shouldn't only be on the learner and the language user, right? It's not something that only depends on you or on our language learners. A lot of it has to do with the context in which people are, and we have to acknowledge that power, privilege, and the perceived worth of who you are for your listeners all has a role in whether we're going to feel like we're not just simply guests of a language. Like, it's not just a language that we're using briefly because for some transactional purpose, it's actually a language in which we're being. it's not just about us. It relates to our context. So an example I can give is from Norton's case study in 2000. She was looking at what makes a language learner successful. And one of her participants was Eva, who's a Polish woman who had a university degree and had a profession, was in a professional field and back in Poland, moves to Canada as an immigrant, and takes on a common job for immigrants at a restaurant. She's cleaning, she's not really using her English, and reports on how her identity changes all of a sudden, like everything she saw, how she saw herself professionally and how she saw herself as a participant of her community was completely different in Canada. She didn't feel like people really wanted to know what she thought or how she, what she felt, how she saw the world. But she gets a chance to socialize with her coworkers once a month, and they learn things like, well, she's Eastern European. That's interesting for them. They have some kind of interest in things coming from Europe. She's traveled around Europe, and many of her coworkers are interested in that too. And all of a sudden, that exchange, that interest that others have in her, give her some agency. So she starts feeling more encouraged to talk about other things, and people are listening, and her language practice increases from that. She even gets a different position at work in which she actually does have to use the language. So again, that example to show that our context does matter tremendously. It'd be interesting to know if she hadn't been, for example, from Europe, had she been of some country in Africa where people were not interested about, would they have listened or cared enough to give her that space too, right? So there's more than just, again, the speaker itself. And we want to talk about how that looks for, things that we can do then to encourage students and to change the environment around us too. So one thing is an example I'd like to share from somebody close to me who was an intermediate language learner at a school in New York, and one day told me that his teacher had said in class, if someone doesn't understand you, you need to tell them, look, you're an English speaker, I'm learning, so it's easier for you to try to understand me. I'm doing my best in speaking the language, so you should try also to understand me. And when he told me this, I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. It sounds pretty bold. All right. Didn't think about it much. Then a few months later, he had to take a driver license test here in the U.S., and he wasn't understanding the directions that the person was saying. And it's kind of a frustrating experience anyways. It's a tense situation. The woman was telling him to turn the blinkers on, do something, and he didn't know. So he remembered, instead of shutting down and being like, oh, my English is not good enough, I can't use it now. He remembered his teacher and said, excuse me, but I'm learning English. You are an English speaker. It's easier for you to try and understand me. Can you please repeat, or can you help me? And he continued on the test, and that actually worked, which to me is a great example of something that a teacher can do to motivate a student in feeling like, if someone's not understanding you, the responsibility isn't all on you. There's a give and take here. And in terms of the ideal self, I think having models of successful non-native English speakers of English is really useful, or having different models really that students can relate to, because these were some of the reasons I was explaining earlier, but you can think of who is someone you've known who is using the language in a way you'd like to use it. Can you envision yourself being that way? What are some of the challenges that person faces? What are some of the challenges you might face? And having those as models might be incredibly empowering. So now Adriana is going to talk about questioning some of the norms.
Yeah, so Natalia mentioned that these issues also are true in the L1, right? So it's like issues of language ownership and identity are present in every language. So I like to bring maybe it's like these issues when you talk about in their own L1, they are more relatable and then you can transfer to English, right? So I like to ask my Spanish speakers, like I ask them a loaded questions, like what's the best in English, right? What's the neutral accent in Spanish? And of course, like there's the answer is like there is no one variety that is neutral or better than others, right? But it's like to bring the experience with their L1 and to tell them like that in English that's also the case. There are different varieties, and these varieties are linked to your identity, and being able to use to switch codes is important. And so we should learn what kind of English we should speak in certain situations. So that's it for the language ownership. So if you have any specific questions. So yeah, Rob really liked the advice of the teacher. I liked it too. I should do that with my students, tell them that you're learning. They should know more than you, right? So they should make the effort.
I think
Okay,
I've
so
done
maybe we
that
should
ever
move
since
on
I
to
started.
critical. Yeah. Critical pedagogy. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences. So if you can read them and just write a true or false, like T and F for each sentence. I'll use the chat box. That's a good question. Maybe there is no such thing as neutral. So neutral, that means like no bias, no no political standing, no stance.
Yeah, when I think of neutral, what I think people refer to is like really they don't have an opinion, they don't take a position on anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, yeah, value free. Yeah, that's a thank you, Mark. Yeah. So yeah, so I don't think language is neutral. There's always like you always establish your position when using language. I do believe that learners should be encouraged to question everything in the classroom and outside the classroom. When planning a lesson, teachers should not assume that learners do not know anything. They always know something, even if they're real beginners. And we should avoid controversial topics in class. That's a difficult one. I was told to avoid controversial topics. I don't. I don't encourage, but I always address these topics when they are brought up by students. And I know that teaching is a political act is a strong statement, but I do believe that teaching is a political act. So there are different definitions of critical pedagogy. So teaching is a political act is from Paulo Freire. I like this definition because he rejects the whole idea of a banking approach to education where students are seen as empty accounts ready to deposits made by the teacher. So students they do not just receive knowledge from teachers. Instead, lessons are constructed on the learner's experiences and previous knowledge. So you always bring what they know and then construct your whole lesson on top of that. In this way, learners are empowered to be agents of their own education. So they're empowered to have control inside the classroom and also empowered to change the realities outside the classroom. So what does it look like for learners? For teachers first. So for teachers, that means that since you are working with whatever students bring to class, lesson planning needs to be more flexible. So you cannot just stick to the textbook or your lesson plan exactly as it is for every class because your students change. So you have to make room for what learners bring to class. And as a suggestion for approach, Scott Thornbury has this whole approach, and there's a book by Scott Thornbury and Luke Maddings, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Teaching Unplugged. And also share power. Lessons should be student-centered not only when it comes to amount of teacher talking. I was told when I was a training to the teacher that teachers should talk only 25% of the time. 75% of the time students should be talking or engaged in activities. But it should be student-centered also when it comes to topic selection and language varieties, like what students want to learn regarding topic and what what English they want to learn, right? They may not want to learn, may not need to learn standard English. And I know a lot of us have a very tight syllabus to follow, so many times we don't have the luxury of actually bringing other topics and other materials to class, but you can always allow students to teach, right, even what's on your lesson plan, and give them more agency in class. That's what it looks like for learners. Not seen as deficient language users. They are not seen as like deficient English speakers. Of course, we're going to correct them, but they are also seen as language users with multiple language sources. So they come with knowledge of language, and they have a lot to transfer and a lot that we can build on. Learner agency was not an issue when I taught EFL in Brazil. The students, they expect to have agency, but it may be an issue in some settings where students are not used to making decisions and actually expect teachers to tell them what to do all at all times. So it's something that you have to negotiate and talk to students. Awareness of assigned identities and power relations. Like we've been talking, like how do you raise awareness of that? Like that there are different identities and it's not fixed, and there are different power relations of like how people perceive you and how you believe your identity is regarding the language. One good framework is Faircloth. It's like the references on the handout. Critical language awareness. And I have an activity suggestion here. So one day oh, the pictures are gone. Okay, so I'll tell you about it. So it's on the handout. So there were, one day my students were late for class in New Jersey. And they told me that there was an accident. That's why the road was closed and they were late. And then I followed a local news website, and they reported on the accident. It was like a mother who was hit by a taxi driver. So and then 4 days later, there was another piece with a slightly different version of the events, right? So the first text written by the same person, the same reporter, said that the mother was walking on the crosswalk and she saved the baby by pushing the stroller. And we worked on like traditional, like read the headline, predict what the text is going to be like. Or we looked at vocabulary, language structure, and then the second text had a little bit different version of the text saying that the mother was not on the crosswalk, that the taxi driver was at the speed limit, and it was the mother's fault. And then we had the names for the mother and the father. The mother had a Latino sounding name, and the taxi driver had an American sounding name. And so the teacher role here is as a guide. I'm not going to tell them exactly what my opinion is on this. But the interesting thing is that I asked them why the texts were different, why the events, the facts were a little not exactly the same. On that day, I had an American teacher sitting in my class. She was going to start teaching that group, and she excused herself to go to the bathroom. And my students were like, "Oh, teacher, we know why it's different. It's because the mother is Latina and the taxi driver is American, so now it's her fault. Now that we know she's Latina." So of course, like the teacher was new. She hadn't developed a relationship with the students where they trusted her. Right, she was a new person, but I do believe that native speaker teachers, especially teaching in a context where they teach immigrants, they do have to be aware that maybe they have to develop that trust, that the relationship where students trust them to be open about what they believe, like how they feel like they are seen by native speakers and Americans, or any other. We are in the US, so we talk American all the time, or in any other country that speaks English. And again, on the handout, you have both texts, so you can read them, and I have the links. And as I didn't do a writing activity, but if I had, because it was an open enrollment class, so we didn't do assignments. But as an assignment, it would be nice to have them write their own version because they were there, many of them, so their own version of the story, right? So it'll be a nice writing activity. And then we are done.
Yeah, so we wanted to, we wanted to have this critical pedagogy section that Adriana beautifully covered here, to be able to give you some input as to what we think after presenting you all these issues and all these different questions that we have about identity and the right to use a language, ownership. There are ways in which we can bring this to the class and to the world around us too. And I think when we're saying, teaching is a political act, it is because we're trying to make change and we're trying to address issues of inequity and inequality. So this is our way of saying, we are aware of it and we want to be able to participate in changing it. Thank you so much for listening to us today.
So if you have to go, I guess, but if you have any questions, you can also email us or contact us on Facebook. Our social media presence is strong, especially Laura's. She's on Twitter and everything. I'm on Twitter too.
Yeah, thanks, too.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, we'll hang around for another couple of minutes. So
yeah.
Feel free to type them in the chat box. And yeah, and thanks a lot, Laura and Adriana. I really enjoyed the webinar. It was very, very informative. So really, really interesting topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us. It was my first webinar, actually. Laura is an expert.
Oh, I could hear Marek.
Oh, Marek said that if you have any questions, yeah, feel free to ask them now, or if you have to leave, you can also leave, or you can have a few minutes of discussion still.
This is a conversation that's been going on social media. So if you're connected to TEFL Equity, for example, on their Facebook page, or on Twitter, if you follow different folks, they're having conversations about this. For sure, it's I think there was an IATEFL plenary too recently that I believe just added some more fuel to the conversation. But maybe Marek can share more about that since he was there.
Yeah. I mean, if you haven't watched the ISFL plenary, I'd definitely recommend it. I think it should be a must-watch for all speakers, really, because it was beautifully done. It was really, really good. So I'll very quickly share the link to it in the chat box if people want to watch it.
That would be great.
Some people are typing, so.
That's my mom. One of Juliana's my mom typing.
Oh wow, Ailey was much faster than I was.
Eliana, yeah.
Oh, there you go, Ailey. Thank you for sharing that link.
Nice.
And
you didn't talk about that, but that's interesting as well. What's the situation, the job market situation like in the States?
So as a non-native speaker, and actually, so I've never. It's funny because I have never experienced discrimination, but because I started teaching ESL in the United States, and I didn't realize there was this whole issue of being from Brazil. Right, it's like, which is normal to have no native speakers teaching English. It was not an issue. And then here in the United States, after I was teaching for a few years, a teacher pointed that out to me, that he was surprised that a no-native teacher was teaching in the United States. But my students actually, I've never gotten anyone asking to have another teacher. And in Brazil, in New Jersey, I taught immigrants, which is not a very sought-after job. And then I started my PhD program, and that's where I experienced native speaker bias, because I teach Portuguese at the University of Arizona. Because I'm a native speaker, so I'm supposed to know, and I don't. I tell my students, I don't. Ask the non-native teacher, she probably knows better than I do.
They don't allow you to teach
but
English.
It's not that they didn't allow me, it's that it was just a better job offer. There are no-native teachers. Some of my classmates do teach at TEFL, which is like this intensive English program, IEP, not the university. So it's not part of the university, but it's on campus. So teaching Portuguese was just more like fewer hours and it's just better. So I was offered that first. I could have asked for a position teaching English. But I do keep that in mind that maybe, like after my PhD, I may not. My PhD is in second language acquisition, not necessarily in English. I have a lot of. We do talk about ESL as well, in EFL in English. But I do realize that maybe I should make my open more doors, not only to teach English, because that may be difficult for me once we talked about that, like getting a job as a non-native speaker in the English department somewhere, it's much harder.
Okay, I think we'll have to wrap it up. So thanks a lot, Adriana and Laura. Thanks again, and we'll have the recording ready as soon as possible, and it will be available on YouTube, on the YouTube channel. I'll post the link again here. If you're interested in watching some of the previous webinars, they're all there as well. So yeah, it should be up there in 2 weeks or maybe a little bit longer. We'll do that.
Okay, thank you, Marek, and thanks, Ailey, for sharing that link too. I'll be checking that out. All right, bye everyone.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Thank you. Bye.